Ladies and gentlemen, our next panel discussion is none other than the men who broke the sound barrier. And as they come up, while David introduces them, I'd like to go ahead and roll the video, please, just for those of you that haven't seen it.
Well, first, quickly, Bob Cardenas, distinguished military career, combat commander, highly decorated test pilot, was flying the B-29 in all of the XS-1 drops. Bob Hoover, World War II POW for 16 months in Germany. And for those of you who have not heard this, he escaped and went to an almost deserted German airfield, found a serviceable Focke-Wulf 190, and flew it out to safety and to freedom. Bob has, as you all know, a distinguished career, one of the great aerobatic pilots, one of the great test pilots, flown over 300 airplanes. He was flying chase that day. He took the famous picture that you've all seen of the Bell XS-1 with the diamonds out behind it. He was flying chase that day. Chuck Yeager, of course, a distinguished career, double ace flying Mustangs from England in World War II. Test pilot, flew the Bell XS-1. Was at right field, is probably the youngest test pilot there, but still got the call by Colonel Boyd to be the primary pilot on the Bell XS-1. Distinguished career, flying every conceivable airplane, commandant of the test pilot school, training astronauts, trained 26 of our astronauts when he was commandant of the test pilot school. And went on to his continued career as a commander in the military and retired as a brigadier general. So there's our panel, gentlemen. I was going to hold this till later, but after we saw the Bell XS-1 come down and do a roll, that looked like a powered flight. Was that a powered flight?
No, it was my first glide flight.
First glide flight. And
yes,
what
sir.
was the profile, according to Colonel Boyd, that he wanted you to fly on that flight?
He didn't give us one. Yeah, we're 3,000 miles away. No, that was the first glide flight. We made 3 glide flights on the airplane, so we had no power. And Cardenas kicked us out around 220 or 230. Stalling speed was around 190 at that speed. So I just rolled it when I dropped away from the B-29. And after Hoover had just about shook us out of the B-29 with his damn P-80, and I came on down and stalled the airplane, felt it out, and then landed on the lake bed. That was the first glide flight. Second glide flight, I did the same thing. After Hoover about shook me out of the airplane again, he just had a habit of buzzing the B-29 right under the X-1, pulling up in front of it, and then Cardenas would cuss, and I would cuss. And then the third glide flight, my last one, when I dropped out of the B-29, Hoover had already buzzed us and went under us and was turning back in to us. So I turned into him. We got in a Lufberry all the way down to the lake bed and landed. And that was all on the card. So, now, you want to go back a little bit about how did the program start?
For those, because everybody's so young here. Let's go back. Bell gets the contract, right, to build an airplane.
Why? You know why? We, like when Bob and I were flying combat in Europe, we ran into compressibility in 43, 44, and 45, obviously, in the Mustang and the Spit and other airplanes. And we knew that a problem existed because of the effects of the speed of sound and buffeting, and consequently the Air Force did too. So the engineering division at Wright Field and Ezra Cocker, Major, and other engineers said, why don't we build an airplane that'll fly in the region of the speed of sound and see if we can't find out what the problems are because of the effects of the speed of sound and solve them. And they went to Bell. Bell said, you know, looking at technology that was available to them, said we can probably build an airplane for a certain amount of money. And the unknowns were many. And the Air Force then gave a contract to Bell to build the XS-1, X Research S Supersonic 1, first contract for a research airplane. And basically, Bell used technology like the fuselage was shaped like a 50 caliber bullet, because bullets go faster in sound, obviously. They built the wings. The first airplane they built, 6062, had an 8% wing thickness to chord ratio and a 6% tail. Now, they stressed the airplane to pull 18 Gs, positive or negative. That's more than the pilot could take. Then, since it would be rocket propelled with liquid oxygen and water alcohol, they decided to drop it from the B-29 to save the fuel it would take to get up there. And besides, the gear was not structurally capable of taking off with a full load of fuel, which is 300 gallons of liquid oxygen and 300 gallons of alcohol. And that's what Bell came out with the X-1. Now, what do we power the airplane with? We have no hydraulic system, electrical systems other than a battery to run the radio and the internal recorders and telemetry system. So they ended up building the airplane with 5,000 pounds of nitrogen gas pressure manifolded in the X-1. Now, they ran that source of 5,000 pounds into the cockpit through a first stage dome regulator that the pilot controlled, reducing it to 1,500 pounds. That was used to lower and raise the gear and to run the flaps down. Then we split that to 2 more dome regulators in the cockpit to reduce it down to roughly 380 pounds, which was used to pressurize a liquid oxygen tank for one dome regulator, the fuel tank with the other dome regulator. Now that forced the fuel back to the rocket motor and ran propellant valves that let you run the rocket motor.
And you had four motors, right?
4 chambers. It was an XLR-11 engine. Each chamber put out 1,500 pounds of thrust. You had 4 switches on the instrument panel, and you could burn 1, 2, 3, or 4, or any combination 2. If you ran one, you had 10 minutes of power, 2, 5, and all 4, 2.5 minutes at full power, 6,000 pounds total. Now, you know, being a rocket, if you're sitting at 35,000 feet, you're getting 6,000 pounds of thrust out of it. Jets don't operate that way. The airplane, I have to explain, when the Air Force gave the contract to Bell, NACA had the responsibility for research flying. Military pilots were never allowed to do research flying. We did stability and control, you know, performance and verification of performance of an airplane that the company put out. We had a test pilot school. It was formed in 1944, and consequently, when the Air Force finished the contract with Bell, Bell built the airplane. The first airplane rolled out. Civilian test pilots flew the airplane. NACA had the responsibility for research, and consequently, they guarded this responsibility very jealously. And they were in charge of the whole X-1 program, and they had Jack Willems was a Bell test pilot that flew the airplane the first 10 glide flights in Florida, creamed it 2 or 3 times because he had a little trouble overshooting. And consequently, he killed himself in the Cleveland air races in a P-39, and Slick Goodland took the airplane over. Now, we watched this, like Hoover and I came into right field in the summer of '45. I was a maintenance officer in the fighter test section, and we didn't test airplanes. And Bob came in about September '45, and, you know, we didn't do a hell of a lot other than running functional test flights on airplanes. We'd jump the test pilots and wax their fanny, and we weren't very popular. And Bob was one of the best fighter pilots I think I've run into, and I was quite surprised that he was only a lieutenant.
Let me go back just a little bit
Yeah.
about since you brought it. A couple of things keep popping into my question. Bob, when Chuck talked about the fact it was important to drop the Bell XS-1 from the B-29, how complicated a job was it? How difficult was it to modify the B-29 to do this? And how tricky, if it was, to fly and to take off in the B-29 with the Bell X-1 underneath it?
Well, they modified the B-29, and my job, I picked up the B-29 at the depot, and my orders were to go up to Bell, load it in, carry it out, but also stop by Wright Patton, pick up the rest of the crew. Now, Boyd had already talked to Chuck, already talked to Jack. He'd picked the whole crew. I was the last guy.
This is Colonel Al Boyd, who was the chief of flight test at Wright Field.
Flight test division.
So he called me in, and so he handed me this one piece of paper, and he said, "You realize the Air Force is on the spot. This is a research project. First time the Air Force has been given the job of research." So I've already talked to Chuck and Bob about safety and whatnot. You're going to be the operations officer. The project is to be brief, progressive, and brief. Safety of flight is paramount, but is not to impede success.
Can you imagine a bomber pilot telling a fighter pilot that safety is a primary factor? But Jesus Christ.
Well, I'd flown fighters also, but I was chief of bomber test. That's why they gave me the B-29. And I followed orders. I picked up the Bell 6th July, I believe it was, and Chuck went through 14 October, July, August, September, October. That was progressive and it was brief.
Okay, Bob, when there were about 125 pilots, right, test pilots at Wright Field, and Colonel Boyd, I understand, anybody who wanted to go for this was able to be considered, and he picked Chuck as number one and you as backup. How difficult was that for you at the time, and how difficult it's been since then, that you were backup and he would never essentially let you fly the airplane?
Well, David, the way it really occurred is that I had been selected first by Bill Council, who's the head of flight test before Boyd came on board. And Boyd came on board and he said, I had buzzed Springfield Airport for Pete Everest. He had told him that he was flying jets and he wasn't. And he said, if you have any fuel left over, how about buzzing Springfield? Which I did. Costliest flight I ever had. 3 months later, he called me into his office and he said, I know two things about you, young man. He said, I want you to tell me, did you buzz the Springfield Airport on such and such a date? I said, yes, sir, I certainly did. He said, well, the two things I know about you is that you're honest, but you're irresponsible. And he said, I'm going to keep you on the program, and I'm going to choose somebody else. And I said, yes, sir. And I was downhearted and just heartbroken because the other people that were in the pyramid to get the project were people that both Chuck and I did not have a lot of respect for as far as their flying ability was concerned. And a couple of weeks later, he called me in, and I was standing there at attention, and he said, I figured out who I'm going to have the primary pilot. And he said, do you know Chuck Yeager? And I couldn't help but get a smile on my face. I felt Chuck was the greatest aviator I'd ever gone up against. And when he told me that, I could hardly contain myself. I was just so tickled to death. He and I were pals, and it was just a delightful relief for me to get to work with Bob and Chuck and the rest of our crew.
Here are three members of the team. The other three were Jack Ridley, Lieutenant Colonel Engineer, Dick Frost, and Jack Russell. All right, Jack Russell was a test pilot engineer.
Was a crew chief on the X-1 from the time he worked for Bell Aircraft Company. Dick Frost was an ex-P-39 test pilot for Bell Aircraft who had been burned. Was a very good, he knew the X-1 intimately. And so he had also been monitoring the test program when Slick Goodland was assigned as a test pilot on the X-1 flew 20 powered flight. Now, the question I'm sure in a lot of people's mind, why did the Air Force take over the X-1? Now, when they finished phase 1, 20 powered flights and 0.8 Mach, hell, we've been fighting the war at 0.8, and consequently, the next phase called to take it out to supersonic speeds are 1.1, and Slick Goodland wanted a $150,000 bonus to do it. And that's when the Air Force, who owned the airplane, and NACA, who was doing the instrumentation and sort of monitoring and co-supervising the program with Bell, the Air Force bowed us back and said, we haven't got that kind of money in the program. That's when Colonel Boyd talked the Air Force into taking the X-1 and assigning it to the Flight Test Division. And as Bob said, we were picked as, I ended up as primary because of my maintenance background probably, and Bob was my backup pilot. And then we were sent out to Muroc. Now, NACA, who had had responsibility for all research flying, and military had never been in it, as I mentioned, guarded their position very jealously, and to a point of where there was a little bit of animosity between them and us on the X-1 team from the military, and it at times got a little bit terse. And Ridley was a guy who was a brain. He had a master's degree out of Caltech and under Dr. von Karman, and Jack Ridley was a brilliant engineer as well as a very good pilot. He and Bob and I were classmates in a test pilot school in 1946. Now, that's when we got out there, the military did not have instrumentation for research flying. We had to bring NACA in. And so they brought him in with Walt Williams, was the head of theirs, a rather pompous individual that didn't particularly care about military guys, thought they were, especially if they were high school graduates. And they, and that's the way we ended up out there. And as Bob was the B-29 driver and Hoover and I, the way I remember it and saw it, Ridley and I made the decision as to what I was going to do with the airplane, because he was a brilliant engineer. And when Jack opened his mouth, Walt Williams and the NACA guys shut up and listened. And that's the way we started the program.
Okay, the six of you, yeah, Bob.
My problem was, number one, keeping track of where Bob and Chuck were and keeping NACA off her back, because as he said, there was a little animosity. We had to work with them as a team because they had some of the ground equipment. But as he said, Jackie and Chuck laid out the flight plan. I remember one time we were talking at the Hyatt, and Lockheed engineer asked me, he said, you guys, you had a computer, didn't you? And I said, no, we didn't have a computer. He said, you had to have. I said, why? He said, well, you needed a computer to develop an energy maneuverability curve for Chuck to fly. I said, well, if it'll make you feel better, we didn't know what an energy maneuverability curve was. But that was the team. They handled the X-1. I kept NACA at bay a little bit and didn't interfere.
All right, you had the three glide flights, and then you start powered flights. Yeah, you start working up to it. Where did Ridley fit into this? How significant was Ridley in this process of figuring out?
Every pre-flight meeting that Jack and I had with NACA to try to pick their brain, because they, had some data, wind tunnel data, out to about 0.9 Mach. We didn't. and consequently we'd sit down and talk to NACA. Now, NACA's objective in this X1 program was meticulously, slowly advancing the speed on the airplane. Hell, we'd still been out there flying it if we'd listened to him. And our job, as General Boyd sent us out to do, was get the airplane above Mach 1 as soon as you can. Don't bust your butt and don't embarrass the Air Force. That's the only thing he told us, and that's about the way we looked at it. And now, first powered flight, I made ground runs, so I knew the airplane, and it was quite well. So I Bob dropped me out at 20,000 feet. Every time I flew the X-1, it was about 40-some times, Bob would count 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. He would always miss 4 or 3. So I really, in fact, I was on the cover of Time magazine. It says 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 3, 2, 1. Printed. It was real good.
I was doing that to catch his attention.
And then, consequently, I dropped out and at 240 indicated, which was a stalling speed of the airplane. And basically, we always lost a little liquid oxygen in the front tank on the climb out because of evaporation. So I'd drop with a aft CG, and even 240 would give me in a partial stall, and I'd have trouble getting the nose down to pick up some speed. And then I already had the domes loaded, everything ready to fire. I'd fire off 1, 2, or 3. On this, my first powered flight, General Boyd said, well, since the airplane's been to 8.2 Mach number, you can go out there. Well, I should have listened more carefully. And
So .82 was the point that day?
yeah, that was my first powered flight. And I remember dropping out, firing off one chamber, and I wanted to check out the motor at altitude. I fired off one chamber, and then a second chamber, one chamber off, third chamber, one chamber off, second chamber off, and ran across the bay. And then at the fourth one, I pulled up and did a roll. Well, when I got the negative G in the roll, a lock scavitated, and my motor flamed out. When I rolled out and got positive, it fired again. I wasn't doing anything. So I enjoyed flying the airplane. It was real smooth. So I got, after about half of the fuel was gone, I turned the motor off that I had on and rolled over and went down across Edwards, or Muir Air Base. And they had some dignitaries out there. And I just wanted to show them that, this was not NACA and this is not civilian, this is military.
You were 24 years old, right?
Yeah, I should have. I went down the runway, no motor on, I was cutting about 500 miles an hour because the airplane's heavy and very clean. And as I came to the end of the runway and pulled it up, I fired all 4 chambers. I couldn't go 0 G, so I ended up having to do a roll to keep, about a half a G positive. And the thing got, and that first thing I was looking at is a 0.85 Mach on the Mach meter, and it was really smoking. And I finally raked it off and jettisoned fuel and came down and landed. And really, he was a wonderful flight test engineer. He wrote the pilot's report for me and sent it back to right field. With a friend like him who needs an enemy. Man, we went to 8.5, General Boyd, or Colonel Boyd, all this crap. And
did the Colonel respond to this in any way?
Christ, man, here's this letter. You will reply by endorsement to why you exceeded 8.2 Mach number. And I said, Ridley, you SOB, you wrote the flight, you answered. He said, no, I didn't fly it, you answered. So, anyway, he wasn't too hot about it. And he said later in life, he said, I really was a little bit pleased that you'd do something like that.
How many flights until you went supersonic? What happened that day?
8.5, about 8.7, 9. Now, the big thing that bit us when we ran into buffeting at 8.8 because of the thin wings, when we got out to 0.94 Mach. Now, this is how the crude things were in the old days. When Bob and I were flying P-84s and P-80, you could take a P-84 straight wing out to 0.82 Mach and it would buffet. You could back up to 0.75 where it's smooth, pull about 3 Gs, and you got the same buffet there that you got at 8.2 straight and level. So I used this technique with the X1 because I thought maybe like if I get to 0.9 Mach and pull 3 Gs, it'll give me a feel what I'll get at 9.2 or 9.3. And this is all we knew. And it was a rather crude way to do flight test work, but we knew nothing else. And when I got the airplane out to point 94, I rolled it over and come back on the control. Nothing happened. The airplane just went straight, and it flopped back and forward. And we came down and Ridley said, we got a real problem, Jack. And it'd been predicted the airplane pitch up or down the region of speed of sound. And Jack said, we had manometer hold. We could trace this shock wave, which had formed on the thickest part of the horizontal stabilizer and the wing. And as we went through, this happened at 8.8. When we got to 9.4, the shock wave was at the elevator, at the hinge point. We lost our effectiveness. And Jack was the guy that figured out, Bell had put a jack screw and the leading edge of horizontal stabilizer tied into this jack screw, air motor on the top, air motor on the bottom, and we used 100 pounds of nitrogen gas pressure that went back to it and split, and I could control it to a solenoid switch on the control column to divert to the top motor or the bottom motor to run this jack screw, and when we ran it, the leading edge of horizontal stabilizer would change angle of incidence. So Jack figured all this out and said, let's try it, because we have no control over the airplane. It's predicted to pitch up or down the region of speed of sound. So we took the cowling off and put some 3-in-1 oil on and ran this thing up and down and got it to working. And then I took it up on the next flight and took it out to 9.4 where I'd lost the elevators and changed the leading edge down 1 degree, and it pulled 3 Gs. And I said, yeah, we got this thing licked. And it came down there, and it only took me 2 more flights. The next flight, I took it to about 9.7. The Mach meter only went to 1.0. I don't think they had a hell of a lot of confidence in it, but it was really... Anyway, I was sitting there looking at, on October the 14th, the 9th powered flight, looking at 9.65, 9.7, and the needle fluctuated and went off the scale. When it did, all the buffeting quit, and the airplane boy really nosed down. I cranked the leading edge down to hold the nose up, and I kept it out there off the scale for about 20 seconds, which extrapolated to about 107, 108 Mach number. Came back, and that's a big thing, came out of the whole X-1 program. It took the British and the French and the Soviet Union 5 years to find out that little trick. If you're going to fly at supersonic speed, you got to have a slab tail. And that big thing came out. Bob was supposed to fly the next week and bailed out of a damn P-84 and broke both his legs, and he never did get to fly the airplane. I wanted him to fly it, but Jack Ridley got to fly it. He was funny because the cockpit's pressurized pure nitrogen, so you have to breathe 100% oxygen. And Ridley's up there, and they had a hell of a big fire warning light in it. And he was smoking out there at about 1.1, and he said, geez, I got a fire warning light. And I said, hell, Jack, there ain't nothing in there that'll burn, meaning it has nitrogen gas and not inert gas in there, so nothing can burn. He said, the hell they ain't, I'm in here. Anyway, damn Hoover, every time we flew, he was up in a P-80, and he was a big help because what he would do, he'd go up to about 40,000 feet and con about 10 miles in front of the B-29. When I dropped out, I could pick him up, and then his aim point for me. But before he went up there, he would come under the B-29 and pull up right in front and just shake up a Jesus. I think the X-one's coming out.
Bob, why did you do that?
Hell, he's Bob Hoover, that's why.
David, let me tell you, I was sitting there at, I believe, 42,000 feet on October the 14th. And I saw Chuck coming up at me. I was watching as best I could see him, waiting for him to get up close.
Yeah, he
to
had a
me.
reconnaissance RF-80 that took beautiful pictures. That's for one reason.
And I'll tell you why. He came by me, and I was watching him approach me. And there was no question in my mind. I was sitting there at 8/10 Mach number, and I felt I was standing still. Right on by. And I tell you, that was a happy day. When we started downhill, I got with Chuck as soon as he emptied all his fuel out. And I joined him. And on the way down, I said, Pard, you're going to get a free steak dinner at Poncho's tonight.
Now, she offered a free steak dinner, first guy to go Mach 1, and really wasn't very good.
David, it was interesting. While we were building up to this program, there was a fellow, and I won't mention his name, with one of the other aircraft companies, and we were in Poncho's bar, and he came over to Chuck and me, and he said, "You guys don't stand a chance. I'm going to get there before you."
Gene Mays?
Yeah.
Douglas.
He said, "This is Douglas Test Pilot." And I said, "Well, Mr. Mays," I said, "I don't really think 10,000 hours of steerman time is going to help you very much in go supersonic." I said, "Chuck and I have about as much time as anybody in the world in jets, and I just think we can make it."
Bob's mean that way. do we have a minute?
Sure.
You know,
I mean,
okay, Bob and we and Jack Ridley, Douglas had made the D558 Phase 2. They made the Phase 1, which was a jet. Phase 2 was a rocket power, had the same rocket engine or X-1. And they started running ads in Aviation Week saying, you know, the Air Force's Bell X-1. And you got to realize September the 18th, 1947, 10 days before I broke Mach 1, the Air Force became a separate service and started bleeding money out of the, you know, the funds that went to the Army and the Navy and people like that. Well, they ran these ads, you know, the Navy did, or Douglas did, and said, the X-1 is a mere trick. You know, it can't take off from the ground. And we were coming out with the D558 Phase 2. It'll take off from the ground, go supersonic. So it's really be the first supersonic airplane. So Ridley said, you know, we can clean their plow when our thing. He said, he figured it all out. He said, we couldn't measure liquid oxygen. So he put half a tank of water alcohol. We could measure it in with a 5-gallon bucket and fill the tank half full. And then we pumped liquid oxygen in, and I sawed a tube of 6 out that contoured the bottom of the wing, and he got his slipstick out, figured out the mean aerodynamic cord, and put a jack under the CG where he wanted it, and we pumped liquid oxygen in until it balanced. And we squirted, you know, a couple 5 minutes more for bleed off, and drug the airplane down to the south end of the lake bed. And the day before the D558 was to fly, and we invited the press up. It'd be the first ground takeoff, and we lined this X-1 up, and I got in it, and I was a little excited because I'd never done anything like that before. And I got in the airplane, and they closed the door, and I started loading the first stage. You know, if man started smelling nitrogen, I'd forgotten to put my mask on. And so I put the mask on, and then I loaded the domes on first and second stage dome, and got everything squared away. I sat down, and I fired off all 4 chambers at the same time on this thing. And I only had, you know, roughly 50% of my fuel, or about a minute and a half or 90 seconds. And that thing broke ground about 1,200 feet, and I flipped the gear handle up. Well, the damn thing accelerated so fast, it blew the flaps up, broke the push-pull rods on the flap. And I pulled the airplane up into an M moment of 23,000 feet and rolled out at 1.1 Mach in 100 seconds. It was really a ride. and of course, it's in the headlines or in the LA Times, and the Navy was really pissed. I mean, really.
You mentioned, I wasn't going to bring it up, but you mentioned ponchos. And I recall you guys talking occasionally you would quote buzz ponchos. But at some point, I understand, General Boyd, what happened? I mean, there was a new rule or something. What?
Well, you know, Buzz and Poncho, there's the guy that started it. We were going to fly the N9M, the first little wing at Northrop built, and for rudders you pushed on the pedals. And Bob, we flipped Ridley, and Bob and I are going to fly it, and Bob won. And so he talked to Jack, you know, trying to find, how can I keep this thing steady, because the Northrop pilots always took off and got in a PIO. And pilot-induced oscillations, in case for you don't understand that. So Bob gets in the airplane, he gets squared away, and he opens up the engine, and he's going down the runway, and it was supposed to come off the ground about 90 miles an hour, and he's up to about 120. And the thing's not flying off the ground like Ridley told him it would. He looked out and he had both these feet pushing on the rudders. Both ailerons are split. And so he pulled his feet off. Damn airplane jumped in the air and he went out of sight doing PIOs. It was a fun.
You know, my plan, I went over in the hangar and I just thought, I've got it trimmed and I'm not going to even touch the wheel. I'll just hold it like this and let it fly itself off, and then I'll have a smooth flight. And I don't know why I had my feet on both of them. I didn't realize they weren't connected like rudders. And
Didn't you read the pilot's handbook?
we didn't have one, if you remember.
In fact, you couldn't even read hardly.
Boy, when I took my feet off those rudders, I went through one wild ride. I don't think anybody's ever seen anything like it.
You're talking about he went to Ponchos and did the first roll with a flying wing right across the roof and buzzed the place 2 or 3 times. And now you're talking about Pete Everest. We went, the China Lake had a Navy Day, and they asked us to bring a couple F-86s up, and I was flying Pete's wing, so I had nothing to do with it. And he took off at 6 o'clock in the morning on Saturday morning and kept it down, because the runway run right over Ponchos, kept it right down on the deck, and I was on his wing, and he went across their place at about 500 knots, and boy, about raised the shingles off, pulled up, and we went to China Lake, came back about 4 o'clock that afternoon, and General Boyd, who was 2-star general, and his aide met us at the airplane. He said, "Man, you guys are in deep trouble." And he said, "General Boyd is in his office, and you're to report there immediately." But Pancho called me and said, "You better call her before you go see General Boyd." And I got on the phone with Pancho. I said, "What the hell's going on?" He said, "Well, you guys probably get grounded for a week at the minimum." Said, "You buzzed our place." Well, the old man was still over here this morning about 6 o'clock. and he was there when you buzzed the place, and he had put out the word at our flying safety meeting the week before that be no more buzzing of Ponchos. And Eric and I went up there and walked in the man, he's sitting behind the desk just glaring at us, and we saluted and stood at attention, and he looked at us, and I understand you boys violated my direct orders. And I figured, man, we probably going to get grounded for a month. And I looked him in the eye, and I said, "General Boyd, how did you know we buzzed Ponchos this morning at 6 o'clock?" And he looked at us for about 2 minutes, and all he said was, "Get out." That was the end of that. No, we had a pretty good time. Pancho was an excellent pilot back in the 30s, flew with Jackie Cochran and other gal. And she ran a very wonderful place. Her food was good, had a swimming pool, and she was very generous to military guys like Bob and I. And because civilian test pilots made a lot more money than we did. And she was very generous to us. She's a wonderful, wonderful gal.
David, let me share something with you about Pancho. When I broke my legs on that bailout, Chuck and Pancho showed up, and I had about as much morphine as they could give you trying to get rid of the pain. And they showed up, and she had on a big old coat. It was in November. And she said, "How you feeling?" I said, "Boy, I think I'm about to die. I've never had such pain like this." And it had been going on all afternoon. I'd been out in the desert there. It took them a long time to find me. And she said the dumb 4-letter words, "Doctors, they don't know a thing about pain, but I do." And she reached down in the pocket of this big old coat, and she pulled out a bottle of bourbon or something or other. And it was, I drink normally, but I'm not slugging it. And she came over to me, and I had just been married about a month. And my wife was sitting there, and she said, "This is what you need." She put her mouth and started running down. I said, and she said, "That's not enough." And she put it up in my mouth again. And I gurgled, and a few bubbles came up, and then she passed it to Pard. And he took a slug, and then she took a slug, and she offered it to my wife, and she just shook her head. And then she started around again. Well, after about an hour of that, they had me in a wheelchair and we were laughing.
How do you compare? Here were the 6 of you, the team, out there in the desert. You break the sound barrier. How do you compare that to flight tests today?
Well, obviously it's a lot safer. You know, there's 46 streets at Edwards named after pilots who were killed out there in test programs. And basically, if you look at what Colonel Boyd did, sent us 6 guys out there, counting the maintenance crews, and said, break Mach 1. We had all of the trust in the world from him. And we had no, you know, Muroc was, in my opinion, sort of manned with the dregs of the Air Force because, you know, and they were caretakers, and we just came out and did test programs and went back to right field. And I think that reason giving us the confidence that we can do what we want to, and we were directed to get that airplane above Mach 1. We got in a lot of flap with NACA at times because I'd go up on a flight, I think 3rd or 4th powered flight, and try to get data at certain points in the flight. Their instrumentation wouldn't work. Then they come down land. Well, the instrumentation didn't work. Go up and repeat the flight. And I said, bull BS. You know. And I said, our job is to get above Mach 1. We're not out here to get data for you. And that probably today that would probably take 600 engineers 6 months to do what we did in 9 flights and 90 days. So.
Well, also we were fortunate as hell because we didn't have the media out there. We didn't have reporters, whatnot, and definitely no television, of course. So we were, in fact, I remember one of the Bell aircraft people that was sent out, they flew into LA, support team, and then they rented cars and came out. This one guy came out, met me, said, where do we work? I said, well, those 2 hangars over there. He said, where do we live? And I said, well, there's a place right back here. He got back in his car and drove back to LA. So it was fairly primitive compared, of course, to what's there now. But in a way, we were fortunate. We didn't have to worry about much.
Yeah, Dave, we were very, I'm telling you, it was a marvelous time for us because it was a milestone in aviation, and we were very lucky. And also, we had the capability of taking advantage of that luck.
David, could I share something along the way? Chuck saved my life when we were going through our training for the X-1 program. We went back and we took probably the most severe punishment as any aviator had ever had at that time because the airplane was designed for 18 and positive and negative Gs. And we both had confidence that we could handle anything. And they put us on the centrifuge to see how much we could handle. And Chuck, he showed me the records. He went back there and a year or 2 ago and visited with the people in the lab, and he had the records, and it showed the kind of Gs that we were going through. And I appreciated your sending it to me, Chuck. But what I wanted to tell you, when we got to the chamber, we were developing a brand new pressure suit, and we went back to the David Clark Company, and that's where we had to get our fittings every once in a while. And when we got the suits, I was in the chamber at about 65,000 feet. And this is the most horrible experience I guess a human being can encounter. I couldn't exhale or inhale. And Chuck happened to look in or maybe he was watching the whole time in the porthole. I couldn't say anything. I was just frozen right there. And I started waving my hands, and Chuck saw me, and they got me rescued. And that was his time to save me. Now, you tell him about that one flight where you got iced up.
Well, in the X-1, sitting against the liquid oxygen, cockpit got very, very cold. And I finally learned to put a dehydrator canister on my oxygen mask's exhale port. But before that, I just finished my run at altitude and was gliding down, and the whole cockpit iced up. The windshield, I couldn't see nothing outside. So I called Hoover and Dick Frost. I said, you know, I can't see nothing. I'll fly the instrument. I don't know where I am. I can't see out. So Dick Frost and Hoover got on my wing and just gave me turns, okay, rolled out. And I could fly instruments because I'd fought a war in England. And I came down and they told me when to round out, touch down, and Hoover said, yeah, best goddamn landing you ever made in the airplane. So,
I said we're even now.
yeah. What you can do. David Clark is very well represented here at the symposium. And basically, Bob Hoover and I were sent up there to get T1 pressure suits in 47 when we were assigned to the X1 program. And we went up there, and David Clark, Munsingware, made panties and bras. I mean, all kinds of stuff. We took a B-25 up there and got measured up for T1 pressure suits. And old David Clark must give us 500 pounds of panties and bras, and we loaded this B-25 up with them, and we were going home. We got struck by lightning. Hoover said, God damn, if we crash, these people wonder what in the hell we're all on. It was funny. But when Bob, we got exposed to a lot of stuff in developing not only the X1 and supersonic speed, but pressure suits and G suits, and we, as Bob said, spent a lot of time up there. We used to take the chamber and get a T1 pressure suit on, get it all tightened up good, and they'd put you in a lock at 20,000 feet, and you'd get ready. They'd take the chamber up to 105,000 feet and then bust a diaphragm out between the lock and the chamber, and it would explode and level off at about 78,000 feet, and your suit would inflate. I tell you, you'd bounce off the seat and fog up, and it was hard work, and we did that for almost 6 months. Man, we used to puke outside that centrifuge room. Oh, it was bad.
Also, I wanted to mention, in talking in terms of primitive, but trying to do it fast, the X1 fully loaded weighed about 12,500 pounds.
13,200.
Okay. Well, that was with you in it. So, to hoist it in there, the only thing we had was a 2,000-pound bomb shackle to hang it there. So we drilled a hole and put a pin in it. So one of Jackie's jobs, he used to fly co-pilot for me on the B-29. One of his jobs, other than helping Chuck get in, was when we were getting ready to drop, he went in the back, and to keep his 5,000 PSI nitrogen, we also had tanks in the B-29 with little tubes hooked up. So you had to pull the tubes off the X1, pull the pin out, come back up. And I often had visions of Jackie going out with the X1. But the other little problem, I used to have nightmares on one thing only, and that was I had a clearance of about 10 inches between the belly of the X1 for takeoff, and there were 600 gallons of liquid oxygen, hydrogen in the back, and sparks don't work well with that. Of course, on takeoff, no problem at all. It was a long runway. But I had visions of someday having to land with the thing hooked on. And once it happened, I asked Chuck, after we couldn't drop, I said, come on back up. He said, hell no, I'm staying here in case it releases prematurely. Finally at 5,000 feet. Of course, he helped me because you dumped out about half of the locks, didn't you? I think it was about half of it. I still had some in there. That was probably the best landing I've ever made in any airplane to keep from scraping the belly of that aircraft.
Do any of you have any questions for these gentlemen? Sir.
I heard that you broke the rib the night before. Is that true?
He heard that you had broken a rib. Tell us about you and Glennis and the horseback ride.
Won't you tell it? You know all about it. No, Glennis and I, now, there's a lot of military guys in here. You got to go back to 1947. When we were sent out there from Wright Field, we were TDY. And I was sent out there, you know, about July of 47. And Glennis and I had gotten married in 45, had 2 boys, and had never really had any relationship of living together. And because I was always gone, like Hoover and I were putting on air shows every weekend. And consequently, I took her out there, or brought her out, and with the 2 kids. Now, I'm TDY. The base commander at Muroc Air Base would not let Glennis use the commissary, the PX. We could get no housing on the base. She got no medical services. I had a daughter born in January of 49. It cost me $200 in the Mojave Hospital. And it was, you know, it wasn't easy for us. So I tried to, you know, when I wasn't flying, which I flew an awful lot, you know, 100 hours a month, every month. And consequently, I took her over to Poncho's on October the 12th on a Sunday night, and we had a nice steak over there. And Poncho gave us a couple of horses. We went riding, and out in the desert about midnight, and we were racing back, and some mother had closed the gate. And man, the time I saw it, I pulled about 3 G's with my horse, and that mother spun out and hit the fence, and I flew off, went across the gate, and hit on my right side and broke 2 ribs. Now, you know, I made a decision, and Hoover knew it, and Jack Ridley, and I said, you know, I told Jack, I said, I've got a problem on Monday morning. We were scheduled to fly to. I said, I don't think I can close the door on the X-1 with this lever. And he said, well, get in the airplane. And I got in the airplane. He brought the door down, held it against it because we hadn't loaded it under the B-29 yet. And I couldn't, my arm and ribs hurt so bad, I couldn't close this lever that came up like a bank door on a vault. And he said, you know, let me look this thing over. He went over to the hangar and got a broomstick and shut off a 10-inch piece of broom.
Could I back you up a second? Did you go to the doctor?
Well, I went to a veterinarian in Roseman because I didn't want to go to the flight surgeon because mother would probably ground me. But, you know, there again, we were out there, we were on our own, and Ridley said, yeah, he could, marvelous engineer. He brought this broomstick, said, you stick it between 2 bars in this door with you and raise it with your left hand, and I think you can do it. And we tried it, and it worked. Man, he was really a good engineer. and that's the way we got the door closed. And, you know, I made the decision to do it, and I talked to Ridley, and you didn't know about it. I don't care what you say.
David, I think his motivation was much more than anything you can imagine. He knew old Dad was waiting to get. I would have had a go at him right then.
Bob, you did know, you didn't know. I
I
mean,
got a call in the middle of the night saying that he had taped up Chuck. Well, okay, I figured Chuck was a big boy, he'd handle the problem. Next morning, as I'm going down the ramp, Walt Williams came alongside, said, how's Chuck feeling? I knew the son of a gun must have been told or somebody. Out in the desert, things spread pretty fast. So I figured if he knew, NACA back east would know, they would call Boyd, etc. So I didn't do anything. However, the night before the flight that we were going to do, Boyd sent his deputy out, Colonel Paul, to fly co-pilot for me on the B-29. That was the old man's way of saying, you know, I gave you guys all the responsibility. You did it. But he sent his deputy out there to fly co-pilot out there. Colonel Paul didn't say he was sent out for that reason. He just came out to fly.
It's amazing what 55 years does to your memory, isn't it?
questions? Yes, sir.
What would you do different if you were going to do it all over again?
What?
What would you do differently if you're going to do it over again?
You know, speculation. I don't speculate. What we did, we were at the right place at the right time, and we had the capability of taking advantage of the situations we were faced with. And yeah, luck plays a big role, but there again, we knew what we were doing. And it just basically, the way Ridley and I'm not an engineer, I'm a high school graduate, but Ridley and I communicated very, very well. And if Jack told me something, I'd risk my life on it. And I had the ability to fly the airplane, and he knew it. See, Jack, the reason I had such confidence in Jack, when we were out here on the X-1 program, a P-84 pilot out of Luke put an airplane into Wickenburg, a little dirt strip, blew both tires, and stopped the airplane. So they asked, you know, Wright Field, how about trying to get this airplane out there? So Jack Ridley and I went down there and took a crew chief and 2 JADO bottles. And old Jack figures out how much fuel we need to take this thing to Luke. And they put the fuel in, and we put the JADO bottles on it. And old Jack gets a dirt field about 3,000 feet long. And he goes and steps this thing off, drives a stake about 10 inches from the end of the runway and says, "You got lots of room." and you know, I got in that, he said, and he came back and said, "Fire your JADO bottles here." I went to the end of the runway, ran that thing up to 100%, released it, fired the JADO bottle, and I broke ground at where Jack drove that last stake. And from then on, Jack Ridley was a Jesus Christ when it came to an engineer. He was really, really good.
Any other questions? Bob Cardenas, Bob Hoover, yes, Bob.
I want to share with you, out of all these many years we've been close friends, I was always in his shadow. And 3 of us here were together one day. Chuck called me up, and I just gotten ungrounded, got my ticket back after the FAA fiasco. And Chuck learned that I was back on flight status and that I would be appearing at Oshkosh at the EAA convention. And Chuck had wanted to have me fly formation for this flight before all of these people. And he was going to fly on one wing, and Bud Anderson was on the other wing in Mustangs, and I was an aero commander. And each of them had one of David's sons in each airplane. And I saw David standing. I said, "Well, why don't you go with me?" And so David went with me. And when we finished the flight, I said, "Thank goodness. For once, he's been in my shadow."
Yeah, Dave, you know, you never get many accolades, but I've known David Hartman for a long time. He was a lieutenant in the Air Force, in SAC, if you want to call it the Air Force. But, but he's really been a marvelous friend to the Air Force, and I've flown him. He's flown F-16s, F-15s, P-51s, and all kinds of airplanes. And he's been really a generous guy with his time to all of the Flight Test Center at Edwards and working with the guys and the SATP. And he's just been a marvelous, marvelous individual. So,
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I would just suggest, I think all of you know who Jim Young is, the historian at Edwards. Between Dick Hallion, whom you will see tomorrow, who's one of the great aviation historians, and Jim Young, they have written the history of what happened that summer of 1947 in exhaustive detail. And it's not just engineering, aeronautics detail, it's personal detail about almost every moment and what was going on. All of you are so interested in aviation and the history of aviation. I really recommend find some of those documents. The Edwards Museum, Jim Young's office, you can get a hold of that stuff, but read it. You have heard only a little bit of it today firsthand from these 3 men, but read the rest of it. It is worth your time and effort. Bob Cardenas, Bob Hoover, Chuck Yeager. Thanks.